The laughter started before she even reached the front of the line. Captain Sarah Johnson stood at attention in the cold morning light of the hangar, her sleeve rolled just high enough to reveal the white bandage wrapped around her forearm, a small dark stain blooming through the gauze like a secret she hadn't meant to share. Someone snickered, then another. Within seconds, the sound spread through the formation like a match dropped into dry grass. Sharp, careless, and impossible to take back. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the flag hanging limp against the wall, and she let them laugh. Nobody in that hangar knew what her arm had been through. Nobody knew what she had done to still be standing there at all. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing people from around the world listening to these stories. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and the kind of quiet strength that never asks for applause mean something to you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. Now, back to Sarah. 3 young soldiers stood closest to her, arms crossed, grinning the way men grin when they've mistaken cruelty for confidence. One of them, a broad-shouldered private named Reyes, tilted his head toward her bandage and muttered something to the man beside him. The words weren't loud enough for the whole formation to hear, but the reaction was. More laughter, more heads turning. Sarah had learned, a long time ago, that silence could be its own kind of armor. She hadn't asked for the bandage to be visible. She had tried, in fact, to keep her sleeve down that morning, buttoned tight over the wound the field medic had redressed only 2 days earlier. But the humidity in the hangar had other plans, and by the time the formation lined up for inspection, the fabric clung uncomfortably to her skin, and she had no choice but to roll it back before it stuck to the wound and tore it open again. She hadn't expected it to become entertainment. General Marcus Thompson entered the hangar at exactly 0700, the way he always did. Unhurried, deliberate, his polished shoes striking the concrete floor with a rhythm that had unsettled entire rooms of soldiers for over 30 years. He was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. Silence followed him the way shadows follow light. He carried a single manila folder under his arm, the kind that meant nothing to anyone in that formation. Just another piece of paperwork, they assumed, another routine inspection detail. Nobody noticed the way his eyes moved across the room before he'd even said a word. Nobody noticed that his gaze lingered, just for a moment, on the young woman standing near the end of the second row, her sleeve rolled up, her jaw set, her eyes refusing to blink. He walked the line slowly, the way he always did, stopping occasionally to correct a collar or straighten a name tape. When he reached Reyes, the laughter in the young man's throat died so fast it might never have existed. General Thompson said nothing to him. He didn't have to. He simply looked, and the boy's spine straightened 3 inches on its own. But when Thompson reached Sarah, he stopped walking altogether. The hangar went quiet in a different way now, not the nervous quiet of soldiers trying not to get caught misbehaving, but something heavier, something that made the air feel thinner. He looked at her bandage. Then he looked at her face. "Captain Johnson," he said, and his voice was calm in the way a held breath is calm. "Would you like to explain your uniform violation?" The words landed like a slap, though his tone never rose above a murmur. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Someone in the back row smiled, thinking they understood exactly where this was headed. Sarah's throat tightened, but her voice came out steady. "No excuse, sir." It was the only acceptable answer, and she gave it the way she'd been trained to, flat, immediate, without a flicker of self-pity. But something in the way she said it made the general go still. He had heard thousands of soldiers say those same 3 words over the course of his career. Most of them said it because they'd overslept or forgotten to shine their boots, or shown up 5 minutes late to formation. He had learned, over the decades, to hear the difference between an excuse being swallowed and a story being hidden. This was the second kind. "At ease," he said quietly, and something shifted in the way he studied her. He didn't ask again. Not yet. Instead, he turned to the soldier standing beside her, a young corporal named Daniels, barely 6 months out of basic training, and asked a single question that would change the entire tone of the morning. "Corporal, do you know how Captain Johnson got that wound?" Daniels blinked. The laughter from moments earlier had drained out of the room entirely now, replaced by something closer to confusion. "No, sir," he admitted. "I just assumed." "You assumed," Thompson repeated, letting the word hang in the air like smoke that refused to clear. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every soldier in that formation understood, in that instant, that assumptions were about to cost someone a great deal more than embarrassment. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that the folder tucked beneath General Thompson's arm wasn't routine inspection paperwork at all. It was Sarah Johnson's combat record, and he had requested it 3 days earlier, the moment he'd first heard her name. To understand why General Thompson carried that folder into the hangar that morning, you would have needed to go back nearly 14 months, to a place far from the clean concrete floors and polished boots of a stateside inspection, to a stretch of dust and heat where the line between courage and survival blurred until neither word meant very much anymore. Sarah Johnson had not always planned to become a soldier. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, the kind of girl who spent her summers fixing bicycles instead of playing with dolls, and who once told her father, at the age of 9, that she intended to be either an astronaut or something that mattered. She chose the Army at 19, not because of some grand patriotic speech, but because her older brother had joined 2 years earlier and come home changed in a way she couldn't explain but desperately wanted to understand. She excelled. Not loudly. Sarah never did anything loudly, but consistently, the way water wears down stone. By the time she reached her second deployment, she had already earned a reputation among her unit as the officer who stayed calm when everyone else's hands were shaking. Nobody in that hangar knew any of this. Nobody knew about the outpost near the Eastern Ridge, the one whose name never made it into any news broadcast, where Sarah's convoy had been ambushed on a road that intelligence had marked, incorrectly, as clear. The first explosion came from the front vehicle. The second came less than 90 seconds later, closer to the rear, where Sarah's Humvee had been trailing behind to provide cover. She remembered the sound before she remembered the pain. A deep, ringing silence that swallowed every other noise, followed by the metallic taste of blood and the sensation of the world tilting sideways. When her hearing returned, she heard screaming. Not her own. Private Elias Cole, 22 years old, barely 8 months into his first deployment, was pinned beneath a collapsed section of the vehicle's frame, his leg bent at an angle that told her everything she needed to know before she even reached him. She didn't remember making the decision to move. She only remembered moving. The gunfire hadn't stopped. It never stopped, not really, not in the way movies suggested. A brief eruption followed by silence. It came in waves, unpredictable, merciless, and Sarah crawled through it anyway, her uniform tearing against twisted metal, her palms raw against the scorched ground, until she reached Cole and began pulling him free with strength she didn't know her body still had. That was when the shrapnel found her arm. She didn't feel it happen. She only noticed, seconds later, that her sleeve had turned a deep, spreading red, and that her hand had gone strangely numb around the strap she was using to drag Cole toward cover. She kept moving anyway. She would later tell the medic, when pressed, that stopping simply hadn't occurred to her, not because she was fearless, but because Cole was still screaming, and as long as he was screaming, she still had work to do. She got him behind the wreckage of a supply truck 12 seconds before a third explosion tore through the space where they'd been lying. She would spend the rest of that year trying not to calculate exactly how close those 12 seconds had come to costing them both everything. The official report called it decisive action under hostile fire, resulting in the preservation of one soldier's life at significant personal risk. Sarah had read that sentence exactly once, in a hospital bed 3 days later, and thought it sounded like it belonged to somebody else. Somebody braver. Somebody who hadn't spent that night afterward staring at the ceiling of a field hospital, hands shaking uncontrollably, wondering if she'd done enough. She had never talked about it. Not to her unit. Not to her family. Certainly not to a hangar full of soldiers who saw a bandage and assumed carelessness. Some wounds, she had come to believe, were meant to be carried quietly. Back in the hangar, General Thompson opened the folder. He didn't open it dramatically. He simply lifted the cover, glanced down at the first page, and then looked back up at the formation with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned, long ago, that the most powerful moments never needed to be rushed. "Private Reyes," he said, "step forward." Reyes did, his earlier confidence visibly draining from his shoulders with every step. "You found something funny this morning," Thompson said. It wasn't a question. Sir, it wasn't meant. I'm not interested in what it was meant to be, Thompson said, still calm, still quiet. I'm interested in what it was. He turned back to the folder. 2 tours of combat duty, he read aloud, his voice carrying easily across the silent hangar. 3 documented IED exposures during active convoy operations. 1 Purple Heart, awarded for wounds sustained while extracting a fellow soldier from a burning vehicle under direct enemy fire. The hangar had gone so quiet that the hum of the overhead lights became audible. A Bronze Star with Valor device, Thompson continued, for continued leadership and composure during a sustained firefight that resulted in 0 additional casualties among her unit. He paused. Sarah's eyes had not moved from that same point on the wall, but something in her posture had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shake. And, Thompson said, his voice dropping slightly, the way a man's voice drops when he is about to say something he wants every person in the room to remember for the rest of their lives, a formal nomination, currently under review, for the Medal of Honor. Nobody laughed now. Nobody breathed, either, for what felt like a very long moment. The wound on her arm, Thompson said, closing the folder, the one several of you found so amusing this morning, was sustained while she dragged a 22-year-old private out of a burning vehicle with her bare hands. Under fire, 12 seconds before that vehicle was destroyed entirely. He let the silence stretch. He wanted it to stretch. He wanted every soldier in that formation to sit inside that silence long enough to feel its full weight. That private, Thompson added quietly, is alive today. He has a wife. He has a 6-month-old daughter he gets to hold every single night because Captain Johnson didn't stop moving when the smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to stop. Reyes's face had gone the color of old paper. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, understanding, perhaps for the first time in his young life, that some silences are far more respectful than any apology could ever be. Sarah still hadn't moved, but her eyes, for the first time that morning, had begun to glisten, not from shame and not from vindication, but from something far more complicated. The particular ache of having a wound you tried so hard to keep private suddenly held up to the light for an entire room to witness. She had spent 14 months trying to convince herself that what she'd done in that convoy was simply her job. Nothing extraordinary, nothing worth a folder, or a formation, or a general's careful, deliberate reading of facts she'd never wanted spoken aloud. But standing there, watching Reyes's face crumble beneath the weight of his own laughter, watching Corporal Daniel stare at her with something between horror and awe, she understood, perhaps for the first time, that some stories don't belong only to the person who lived them. Some stories belong to everyone who needs to be reminded what courage actually looks like. What none of the soldiers realized, standing frozen in that hangar, was that General Thompson had not chosen this moment by accident. 3 days earlier, sitting alone in his office long after the rest of the building had emptied for the evening, he had received a phone call from a colonel stationed at the outpost where Sarah's unit had served. The colonel wasn't calling about her nomination. He was calling about something else entirely. A rumor, quiet but persistent, that Captain Johnson had been requesting a transfer out of a leadership position, citing what she described only as personal readiness concerns. Thompson had served for 31 years. He had watched more soldiers than he could count come home from combat carrying wounds no bandage could cover. Wounds that manifested not in scars, but in silence, in flinches at sudden noises, in the particular exhaustion of a person who had given everything and wasn't sure, anymore, that there was anything left to give. He had lost a nephew to exactly that kind of invisible wound, 11 years earlier. A young man who had survived 2 deployments without a scratch on his body, and who had nonetheless disappeared into himself so completely that by the time anyone around him recognized what was happening, it was already too late. Thompson had promised himself, standing at that funeral, that he would never again watch a soldier drown in silence without at least trying to throw them a line. That was why he had requested Sarah's file. Not to shame the soldiers who'd laughed at her. Not even, if he was honest with himself, entirely for her sake. He had done it because he needed her. Needed the army to need her. Publicly, undeniably. In a room full of witnesses who would carry the memory of this morning with them for the rest of their careers. He needed her to understand that stepping back now, quietly, unnoticed, was no longer an option. Not because the army couldn't survive without her. Because he suspected, watching the way she held herself even now, spine straight despite everything, that she needed to be reminded she still mattered. That the version of herself who had crawled through gunfire to save a stranger's life hadn't disappeared just because the silence afterward had grown too heavy to carry alone. He hadn't planned to read her file aloud in front of the entire formation. He had planned, if he was honest, something quieter, a private conversation, a request that she reconsider her transfer, perhaps an offer to connect her with resources the army didn't always advertise clearly enough. But then he'd walked into that hangar and heard the laughter, and something in him, something old, something that remembered his nephew's face in a way he could never fully explain to anyone who hadn't lost someone the same way, had refused to let the moment pass quietly. Sometimes, he had come to believe, the kindest thing a leader can do is make sure the whole world sees what one person has been carrying alone. After the formation was dismissed, most of the soldiers dispersed in near-total silence, casting glances back towards Sarah that ranged from guilt to something close to reverence. Reyes lingered longest, his jaw working as though he were trying to assemble an apology large enough to match what he'd done, and failing to find the words. He finally settled on the only thing that felt true. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." Sarah studied him for a long moment. She could have made it easier for him. She could have brushed it off with the kind of gracious deflection officers were trained to offer. Instead, she chose honesty, because she suspected he needed it more than comfort. "You didn't know?" she said. "That's not an excuse. But it's the truth. Next time, before you laugh at someone's scars, ask yourself if you actually know their story." Reyes nodded, and something in his posture suggested the lesson had landed somewhere it would stay. General Thompson waited until the hangar had emptied before approaching her directly. He didn't offer congratulations. He didn't offer sympathy, either. He simply stood beside her for a moment, both of them looking out through the open hangar doors toward the flag moving gently now in a rising morning breeze. "You requested a transfer," he said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation. Sarah's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir." "Why?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he wondered if she intended to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the flat, controlled cadence of formation and become something rawer, more uncertain. "Because I keep waiting to feel like the person in that folder," she admitted. "And most days, I don't. Most days I just feel tired, sir. Like I used up whatever I had left back there, and I'm not sure what's supposed to be left to lead with now." Thompson nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "That feeling," he said, "doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're honest. Every soldier who's carried what you've carried feels exactly what you just described. The ones who tell you otherwise are usually the ones who need help the most and refuse to admit it." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I'm not going to approve your transfer," he said. "Not because the army needs another captain. Because I think you still have something left to give, even on the days it doesn't feel that way. And because I think the soldiers in that hangar needed to see, today, what it actually looks like to keep going even when nobody's clapping for you." Sarah's eyes glistened again, and this time she didn't try to hide it. "I don't know if I can be what they need me to be," she admitted quietly. "Nobody ever does," Thompson said. "That's not weakness, Captain. That's every leader who's ever mattered." In the weeks that followed, something in the unit shifted, quietly, the way meaningful things usually do. Reyes requested to be assigned under Sarah's direct supervision for an upcoming training rotation, a decision that surprised nearly everyone who'd witnessed the hangar incident. When asked why, he simply said he wanted to learn from someone who understood what actually mattered under pressure, rather than someone who merely talked about it. Corporal Daniels began stopping by Sarah's office once a week, initially with minor questions about protocol, though the conversations gradually deepened into something closer to mentorship. He confessed, eventually, that he'd struggled silently with his own doubts since returning from his first deployment, doubts he'd never voiced to anyone, afraid they'd be mistaken for weakness. Sarah listened. She didn't offer easy answers, because she'd learned there weren't any. But she offered something rarer, the simple, steady presence of someone who understood exactly what he meant, without needing it explained. The Medal of Honor nomination continued through its long, careful review process, though Sarah rarely spoke of it. She had stopped needing external proof of what she already knew to be true about that night on the ridge. The medal, if it came, would belong to the Army's history. The moment itself, Cole's face, the 12 seconds, the decision she'd made without thinking, belonged only to her. Private Elias Cole, the young soldier she had pulled from the wreckage, wrote her a letter that spring. It was short, awkward in the particular way that young men's letters often are, filled more with the things he couldn't quite say than the things he could. But the final line stayed with her longer than almost anything else that year. "My daughter's first word was dada," he wrote. "I got to hear it because of you. I don't know how you say thank you for something like that. I don't think the words exist yet." Sarah kept the letter folded inside her uniform jacket for months afterward, not as proof of heroism, but as a quiet reminder of exactly why she had chosen, in the end, to stay. Nearly a year after the hangar incident, Sarah stood once again in front of a formation, though this time, the circumstances could not have been more different. The ceremony was small, deliberately so, held in the same hangar where the laughter had once echoed off concrete walls. General Thompson stood at the podium, considerably grayer than he'd been the year before, his voice carrying the same measured calm it always had, though something in his eyes suggested this particular moment meant more to him than most. "A year ago," he said, addressing the formation, "in this very hangar, a young officer stood before you with a wound some of you found amusing. I want you to understand something clearly today. That wound was earned pulling a fellow soldier from a burning vehicle, under direct enemy fire, at a moment when every reasonable instinct would have told her to save herself instead." He looked directly at Sarah, standing at attention near the front of the formation, her uniform immaculate, her bandage long since healed into a thin, pale scar she no longer bothered to hide. Today, the Department of the Army formally recognizes Captain Sarah Johnson for actions above and beyond the call of duty. The room was utterly silent as Thompson read the official citation aloud. The ambush, the wreckage, the 12 seconds that had separated survival from tragedy. When he finished, he stepped forward and, with careful, deliberate hands, placed the pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor around her neck. Sarah stood rigid, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed once again on that same point on the far wall, though this time, for entirely different reasons. This time, the tears she fought to hold back weren't born of humiliation. They were born of something far heavier and far more complicated. The particular grief of finally being seen for something she had spent so long trying to carry alone. Somewhere near the back of the formation, Reyes stood at attention, his eyes fixed on her with an expression that had nothing left in it of the laughter from a year before. Beside him, Corporal Daniel stood a little straighter than usual, having learned, over the course of that year, exactly what kind of leader he wanted to become. When the ceremony ended and the formation was finally dismissed, Sarah remained standing a moment longer than necessary, her fingers brushing lightly against the medal now resting against her chest. She thought, briefly, of Cole's daughter, a little girl she had never met, who would grow up hearing her father's voice instead of only stories about him. She thought of the 12 seconds. She thought of the laughter that had once filled this same room, and the silence that had eventually replaced it. Not the silence of shame, but the silence of understanding. General Thompson approached her one final time before she left the hangar that day. He didn't say anything about medals or citations or the long road that had led them both to this moment. He simply said, quietly, "How are you feeling, Captain?" Sarah considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned to over the past year. "Tired," she admitted. "But like myself again. Both, I think, at the same time." Thompson nodded, understanding completely. "That," he said, "is usually what healing actually looks like. There's a particular kind of silence that follows people who have survived something the rest of us can barely imagine. A silence that has nothing to do with shame and everything to do with carrying a weight too large for easy words. We are quick, sometimes, to judge the wounds we don't understand. Quicker still to laugh at the things we haven't taken the time to ask about. But every scar carries a story. Every bandage hides a moment somebody lived through so that someone else could keep living." Sarah Johnson never asked to be seen as extraordinary. She simply refused to stop moving when it mattered most. And in doing so, she became exactly the kind of soldier and exactly the kind of person that an entire hangar full of strangers would spend the rest of their careers trying to become. Somewhere tonight, a little girl is falling asleep to the sound of her father's voice, never knowing how close she came to growing up without it. Somewhere tonight, a general is thinking about his nephew, grateful that at least once he managed to throw the line before it was too late. And somewhere, a young captain touches the thin scar on her arm and remembers that the bravest thing she ever did wasn't surviving the wound. It was letting someone finally see it. If this story moved you, I'd love to know which moment stayed with you the longest. Was it the silence in the hangar, the letter from Cole, or the medal finally placed around her neck? Let me know in the comments, and if stories like this one matter to you, consider joining this community by subscribing. There are more stories like Sarah's waiting to be told, quiet acts of courage that deserve to be remembered.